What happens when a veteran, someone who once sacrificed to protect freedom and peace for his country, is humiliated by those meant to represent justice? A racist police officer spits on and arrests a black veteran. But when a shocking secret about the veteran's son is revealed, everything changes. This is not just a story of injustice, but a testament to the power of resilience, dignity, and the capacity for change when faced with the truth. Before we dive into this deeply emotional story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Henry Carter stepped into a small diner located in a predominantly white neighborhood. His old olive-green military jacket, buttoned tightly, kept him warm on the crisp morning. The diner was quiet, with only a few patrons sipping coffee, and a young waitress stood behind the counter, reading a crumpled newspaper. Henry nodded politely at her before choosing a small table near the window. He placed his calloused hands on the table and quietly glanced at his watch. His son, Ethan Carter, was supposed to have arrived a few minutes ago, but Henry didn't mind. He was long accustomed to waiting, a quality honed over the many years of his life. Soon after Henry sat down, he could feel furtive glances around him. Quick, fleeting looks, but enough to remind him that he was in a place where his presence was not welcome. Henry paid them no attention. He told himself this was just another day, another cup of coffee in an unfamiliar town. Henry gestured to the waitress, who approached with a neutral expression. "Just a cup of coffee, please," he said with a polite smile. The waitress nodded without a word, poured him a cup of coffee, and walked away. Henry picked up the cup, feeling its warmth in his hands, and let his eyes wander around the room. The sound of the diner's bell suddenly rang out, drawing his attention to the door. A police officer entered, tall, with a perpetual scowl, as if the world itself was an inconvenience to him. The officer's gaze, Richard Miller, quickly scanned the diner and landed on Henry. Without bothering to hide his displeasure, Richard strode directly toward Henry's table. His heavy footsteps echoed on the tiled floor, and he stopped right in front of Henry, arms crossed, his shadow casting a dark pall over the table. "Lost, are we?" Richard asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Henry looked up, his expression calm and unchanged. "No, I'm waiting for my son," he replied, his voice steady as if it were just a casual question. But deep down, Henry understood the real intent behind Richard's words. Richard smirked, his lips curling in disdain. "Your son, huh? Don't see many people like you around here. How long are you planning to wait?" Henry took a slow sip of his coffee, then set the cup back down deliberately. "As long as it takes, officer," he replied, his gaze unwavering. Richard sniffed, a sneer forming on his face. "This isn't a place to loiter around. Makes people uncomfortable, you know." Henry met Richard's eyes unflinching. "I'm not bothering anyone, just having my coffee," he said, his voice even. Richard leaned closer to the table, lowering his voice but making his tone even colder. "Let me see your papers, old man." Henry continued to hold Richard's gaze, unmoved. After a few moments, he slowly reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a veteran's ID card, and handed it to Richard without a word. Richard took the card, glanced at it dismissively, and tossed it back onto the table as though it were worthless. "Veteran, huh? I don't buy it," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "You think a little card like this gives you the right to sit here?" Henry's gaze remained firm. "Believe it or not, officer, I know who I am," he replied. Richard let out a loud, derisive laugh, breaking the quiet of the diner and drawing the attention of the other patrons. "You're the kind of guy who likes to play noble, pretending you're somebody important." Henry didn't react, though his patience was wearing thin. "Do you have a problem with me, officer?" he asked, his tone calm but deliberate. Richard leaned in closer, his voice now a menacing whisper. "My problem is people like you thinking you can go anywhere, sit anywhere, and no one will say a thing. You don't belong here, and I don't like your type trying your luck." Henry's grip tightened slightly around his coffee cup, feeling the tension rise in the room, but he kept his tone measured. "I'm just a man having coffee," he said softly, yet resolutely. Henry tightened his grip on the coffee cup, his gaze calm as he faced the towering police officer in front of him. Richard Miller, large and imposing, with a disdainful glint in his eye, leaned over the table, his shadow completely blocking the light falling on Henry. The air in the diner grew heavier, as though any wrong move could ignite an explosion. "What are you doing here?" Richard asked, his tone slow and dripping with mockery. Henry lifted his head, his expression betraying no fear. "As I said, I'm waiting for my son," he answered deliberately, his voice low and measured. Richard raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a cold smile. "Your son, huh? Don't see anyone around here who looks like you. Sure you're not lost, old man?" Henry quietly set his coffee cup down, his gaze steady on the officer. "I'm certain," he replied shortly, his tone calm yet resolute. Richard snorted, crossing his arms over his chest in a stance that screamed authority. "Interesting. This isn't the kind of place we usually see your type, especially sitting alone like this. Don't you find it odd?" Henry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took another sip of coffee, unhurried, before finally replying. "I don't find it odd to have coffee and wait for my son, officer. Is there something wrong with that?" Richard let out a loud laugh, a sound that filled the quiet diner and caused heads to turn. A few patrons whispered to each other, clearly aware of the growing tension. "You think paying for a cup of coffee makes you welcome here?" Richard sneered. "Don't fool yourself, old man. Everyone here sees you for what you are, a misfit." Henry met Richard's gaze without flinching, his face calm, though his eyes flashed with quiet defiance. "I'm not bothering anyone. If anyone's uncomfortable, that's not my problem." Richard leaned in closer, his face mere inches from Henry's. "You ought to understand this isn't a place for you to sit around, especially not when you're making people uneasy." Henry didn't respond right away. He stared directly into Richard's eyes as if searching for the man behind the uniform. "I don't believe my presence here harms anyone," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm just a man having coffee and waiting for my son. If you're uncomfortable, perhaps you should ask yourself why." Henry's words caused Richard to pause briefly, but he quickly recovered his composure. He smirked and stepped back slightly, but kept his eyes locked on Henry. "All right, you think so, but I'll be keeping an eye on you, old man. Don't make me repeat myself." Richard glanced around the diner, ensuring every set of eyes was on him, before stepping back a few paces, maintaining an air of superiority. "And remember," he added, pointing at Henry's coffee cup, "don't do anything to make me think you're causing trouble." Henry didn't reply. He took another sip of his coffee, his gaze unwavering as it followed Richard. The air in the diner was thick with discomfort, but Henry sat there, steady as a rock amidst the storm. Behind the counter, the young waitress, Anna, discreetly pulled out her phone and started recording. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it up, unable to stand by and watch the officer's aggression toward an elderly man simply drinking coffee. She had no idea that this small act would ignite outrage across the community. Richard strode toward the exit, but before stepping out, he turned back and pointed a finger at Henry. "I'll be back, And if you're still here, don't say I didn't warn you." Henry said nothing, his eyes tracking Richard until he disappeared out the door. Deep down, Henry knew this wasn't over, but he had faced far worse in his lifetime and wasn't about to let someone like Richard intimidate him. Henry remained seated at the table, his gaze fixed on the window as if choosing to ignore the judgmental stares around him. But he was well aware of what was coming. Not long after Richard left, the diner bell jingled again. The tall officer returned, his demeanor even more aggressive than before. Richard marched straight toward Henry, his heavy boots echoing ominously on the tiled floor. A few patrons nearby stopped sipping their coffee, whispering amongst themselves as they nervously watched the scene unfold. "Still here, huh?" Richard barked, his voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere. "I thought you'd know better than to stick around after our little chat." Henry turned to face him, his calm eyes meeting Richard's stormy glare. "I told you already, officer. I'm waiting for my son," he said, his tone steady and clear. Richard crossed his arms, smirking. "Your son, huh? Funny. I don't see anyone here who looks like you. Sure you're not just making that up, old man?" Henry slowly lifted his coffee cup, took a small sip, and placed it back down on the table. "I'm certain, officer. I'm not making it up," he replied, his voice as steady as ever. Richard leaned in closer, his gaze piercing. "You think you're clever, don't you? I've seen your kind before, always acting like you're entitled to be wherever you want. But this isn't your place. You don't belong here, and you should know that." Henry held Richard's stare for a long moment before calmly reaching into his jacket pocket. He retrieved his veteran's ID card and placed it on the table in front of the officer without a word. Richard picked up the card, glancing at it briefly with obvious disdain. After a moment, he let out a loud, mocking laugh that filled the diner and shattered the tense silence. A few patrons flinched, while Anna continued recording quietly, her hands trembling slightly. "Veteran, huh?" Richard said, his tone as heavy with sarcasm. "You think this little piece of paper proves anything? Look at you. You seem more like a storyteller than a soldier." Henry's expression remained impassive, but his eyes sparkled with resolve. "I don't need you to believe me. I know who I am, and I'm not here to seek your permission." Richard tossed the card onto the table, where it slid off the edge and fell to the floor. "Enough of this," he spat. "Guys like you always have some story to tell, don't you? Always bragging about what you earned." Henry bent down slowly, picked up the card, and slid it back into his pocket. "If you have a problem with me, officer, say it outright," he said, his voice steady but firm. Richard leaned in even closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "My problem is with people like you, thinking you can go anywhere, do anything. You don't belong here, and I don't want you here." The tension in the diner was suffocating. Every other patron sat silently, trying not to attract attention. A young woman at a nearby table shook her head subtly while Anna, still behind the counter, continued recording, her phone shaking slightly in her hand. Henry remained unmoving, his gaze steady. "I'm just here, having coffee and waiting for my son. You don't have the right to make me leave." Richard smirked again, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "Oh, you think so? Let me remind you, this isn't a place for you to play big shot." Without warning, Richard reached out and pushed Henry's coffee cup, spilling the hot liquid across Henry's worn jacket. The dark stain spread across the fabric, dripping onto the tiled floor. The diner fell into a stunned silence. A few gasps broke the quiet, while Anna froze for a moment before continuing to film, her hands trembling more noticeably now. Richard stood upright, his grin dripping with malice. "How does that feel, huh? Familiar? This is our place, old man. You don't have any rights here." Henry took a deep breath, his voice steady despite the heat of the coffee soaking through his jacket. He stared directly into Richard's eyes, his gaze sharp as steel. "You can spill my coffee, but you can't make me small. I've faced worse than you in my life." Henry's words cut through Richard's arrogance like a blade. For a brief moment, the officer faltered, but his anger quickly took over. He leaned down once more, his voice low and cold. "You have two choices. Leave now, or I'll make sure you never come back." Henry didn't blink. "I'll stay here and wait for my son. If you want to arrest me, go ahead." Richard loomed over Henry, his eyes blazing with anger. The other patrons in the diner watched silently, some lowering their heads to avoid attention, but all could feel the tension thickening in the air. It was as though the very walls of the diner held their breath as Richard leaned in closer, his voice sharp and commanding. "Stand up. I told you, you don't belong here. Don't make me make this harder than it has to be." Henry didn't move. He remained seated, his hands resting calmly on the table, his eyes steady as they met Richard's. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm sitting here drinking coffee and waiting for my son. If you're going to arrest me, I'd like to know the valid reason for it." Richard's jaw clenched, his face flushing red, as though Henry's calm reply was an unbearable challenge. "A reason?" Richard spat, his voice rising. "The reason is that I said so, and if you don't stand up right now, I'll make sure you never forget this day." Without waiting for a response, Richard grabbed Henry's arm roughly. The sudden, forceful action caused Henry's chair to scrape loudly against the floor, echoing through the diner. Henry steadied himself, refusing to stumble, but he felt the full strength of Richard's grip tightening around his arm. "What are you doing?" Henry asked, his tone still calm but firmer now. "Teaching you your place?" Richard growled, pulling out a pair of handcuffs from his belt and locking Henry's hands behind his back. The act stunned everyone in the diner. An elderly woman sitting nearby gasped and exclaimed, "He's just drinking coffee. How can you do this to him?" Richard turned sharply to her, his voice menacing. "Stay out of this if you don't want to be next." The woman shrank back, visibly shaken, but her eyes burned with a mix of fear and indignation. The young waitress, Anna, held her phone tightly, continuing to record the scene with an impassive expression. Inside, her frustration and anger boiled over, but she knew capturing the truth was the only way she could help. Richard yanked Henry toward the door, his grip firm. Henry followed, his steps steady, despite his hands being bound behind his back. His gaze remained fixed forward, unwavering even as whispers filled the diner. As they stepped outside, the bright daylight struck Henry's face, glinting off the windows of the police cruiser parked nearby. Richard shoved Henry toward the car, making him stumble slightly as his back hit the vehicle. "Don't think I'm going to go easy on you," Richard muttered, his tone low and threatening. Henry turned his head, locking eyes with Richard. His voice was calm but cutting. "You can do whatever you want, but you can't change the truth. What you're doing isn't justice. It's fear and weakness dressed as authority." For a brief moment, Richard faltered, the weight of Henry's words breaking through his bluster. He quickly masked his hesitation with a rough shove, opening the cruiser door and forcing Henry into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a loud bang that seemed to shake the silence. Richard climbed into the driver's seat, his expression smug as he glanced at Henry through the rearview mirror. "How does it feel, old man? How does it feel to be put in your place by the law?" Henry met his gaze in the mirror, his eyes steady and unflinching. "The law? This isn't the law. This is an abuse of power. You're not stronger because you wear a badge. You're weaker because you're afraid of someone like me." Richard laughed, but the sound lacked the confidence it held earlier. "You'd better watch your mouth. You're in a police car now. I can take you anywhere I want." Henry leaned forward slightly, his voice measured but razor-sharp. "Then take me. But remember, your actions won't silence me. People like you think power is a weapon, but you're wrong. It's a responsibility, and you've wasted it." Inside the diner, Anna's hands shook slightly as she pressed the button to upload the video. Her voice was soft but resolute as she murmured, "We can't let this happen anymore." She quickly typed a caption. "A black veteran arrested for no reason. Is this how we treat those who served our country? Share this so justice can be served." Within 10 minutes, the video had amassed hundreds of shares and comments. The headline, Anna wrote, "Black veteran arrested for drinking coffee. Is this justice?" struck a nerve, igniting widespread outrage. Views skyrocketed, surpassing 10,000 in just 30 minutes. Comments poured in, brimming with anger and disbelief. "Unbelievable. Is this how we treat veterans who served our country? Our heroes deserve respect, not humiliation. This kind of officer needs to be removed immediately." Users began tagging human rights organizations and major media outlets, demanding action. Hashtags like Justice for Henry and Stop Police Abuse quickly began trending across social media platforms. Posts related to Henry's incident garnered tens of thousands of likes, shares, and comments. Within an hour, local human rights organizations took notice. A group called Justice for the Community tweeted, "We cannot tolerate this abuse of power. We are monitoring this situation and will demand accountability from the local police department." Journalists from major outlets such as CNN and ABC News shared the video, adding commentary, "A veteran mistreated in a diner. This is not just an individual issue, it's a systemic problem." Prominent figures, including actors and athletes, joined the conversation. One well-known football player tweeted, "Henry Carter, we stand with you. No one deserves to be treated this way, especially someone who gave their life to serve our country." In the small town where it all happened, the story spread like wildfire. Patrons from the diner called their families and friends, recounting the incident. Discussions erupted in coffee shops and grocery stores. One elderly man, a retired serviceman who had served alongside Henry, gave a heartfelt interview to the local press. "Henry is one of the most honorable men I've ever known. It breaks my heart to see him treated like this just because of the color of his skin." Residents organized a peaceful march to demand justice for Henry. Flyers circulated quickly, and social media posts urged everyone to participate. Meanwhile, at his home, Ethan Carter was preparing documents for a meeting when his phone buzzed repeatedly. At first, he ignored the calls, assuming they were routine work matters. But after the fifth call, in under a minute, he frowned and picked up. It was a close colleague. "Ethan, have you seen the video?" The voice on the other end was tense. "What video?" Ethan asked, sensing trouble. "Your father. He was arrested this morning. A cop, Richard Miller, did something unacceptable. The video is everywhere." Ethan froze. "My father? Arrested? For what?" "There's no valid reason," the colleague said quickly. "It's a blatant abuse of power. You need to see the video." Ethan pulled up social media and searched his father's name. The video was the first result, accompanied by thousands of furious comments. As he watched it, Richard's actions, his father's composed defiance, anger and grief welled up inside him. His grip on his phone tightened. His phone buzzed again, this time a call from a family friend. "Ethan, you need to act. Henry doesn't deserve this. The whole town is talking about it." Ethan took a deep breath, trying to remain composed. "I will. Thank you for letting me know." Grabbing his keys, Ethan left his house, driving faster than usual. The images from the video replayed in his mind, along with Richard's voice. This wasn't just an affront to his father. It was a betrayal of the justice system Ethan had dedicated himself to. As his phone continued to buzz with messages from colleagues and townsfolk, "Ethan, you have to get justice for Henry. Don't let this slide. We're all with you." Ethan's determination solidified. He gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes burning with resolve. He wasn't just Henry's son. He was a man committed to justice, and he would not let this stand. The heavy metal door to the holding area creaked open, its echo resonating down the cold hallway. Ethan strode in, his eyes scanning the desolate cells until they landed on Henry. His father was sitting against a concrete wall, hands cuffed behind his back. Despite the oppressive surroundings, Henry's face retained an extraordinary calm, a serenity that seemed to defy the weight of the moment. "Dad!" Ethan called out, his voice a mix of anger and concern. Henry lifted his head, his eyes brightening at the sight of his son. "Ethan," he said, his voice steady but tinged with relief. "You're here." Ethan quickly approached the cell, gripping the cold iron bars tightly. He turned to the nearby guard, his tone sharp and commanding. "Open this door. Remove those cuffs, now." The guard, visibly tense, stammered, I can't, Captain. It's Officer Miller's orders." Ethan spun back, his glare cutting through the air. "I don't care whose orders they are. This is my father. Unlock the door and take those cuffs off, immediately." Under Ethan's intense pressure, the guard hesitated before reluctantly retrieving the keys. The cell door clanged open, and the guard removed the cuffs from Henry's wrists. As the metal restraints fell to the floor, Henry rubbed his wrists gently, then looked up at Ethan. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now but still laced with fury. Henry nodded slightly. "I'm fine. Don't worry about me. But, son, you need to understand. This isn't just about me. It's about something much bigger." Ethan grasped his father's hand, his resolve clear in his eyes. "I know. But first I'm going to make sure the person responsible for this answers for it." Ethan guided Henry to a small waiting room outside the detention area, ensuring his father had a place to rest before turning and striding toward Richard Miller's office. His footsteps echoed through the corridor, each one heavier with barely contained rage. Officers along the way stepped aside, their gazes following Ethan as he slammed open the door to Richard's office. Richard Miller sat behind his desk, feigning calm. When he saw Ethan, he shot to his feet. A flicker of unease crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with forced confidence. "Captain Carter, I didn't expect you to come here so quickly," Richard said, attempting to keep his tone even, though it wavered slightly. Ethan closed the distance between them with purposeful strides. "What did you do to my father?" His voice was cold, sharp as steel. Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting. "Captain, I didn't know he was your father. If I had known, this would never have—" "It doesn't matter whether you knew or not." Ethan interrupted his words, cutting through the air. "What matters is how you treated him. A veteran, a man who did nothing wrong but sit and drink his coffee. You think your badge gives you the right to humiliate and arrest him?" Richard tried to maintain his composure, but his voice trembled. "Captain, he was being uncooperative. He was challenging me. I was just following protocol." "What protocol?" Ethan's voice rose, resonating through the office. "What protocol allows you to insult, humiliate, and handcuff an elderly man because he doesn't fit your prejudice. What protocol gives you the right to think your authority is greater than respect and justice?" Richard backed up slightly, his smile strained. "Captain, I admit, I may have overreacted, but I didn't mean any harm. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Ethan's tone was scathing, his gaze burning. "Your job is to protect the community, not abuse your power to satisfy your ego. What exactly did my father do to warrant this treatment?" Richard struggled to find an answer, his eyes darting nervously. I didn't think it would go this far." Ethan stepped closer, his voice now cold and deliberate. "How far, Miller? Did you think you could shove my father out of a diner, humiliate him in front of everyone, and lock him up without facing consequences? Stop blaming circumstances. Take responsibility for your actions." Richard's attempt at confidence crumbled under Ethan's unrelenting intensity. "Captain, I just thought he didn't belong there." Ethan stepped back slightly, his expression hardening with disgust. "That's the real problem, isn't it, Miller? You didn't think my father, a veteran, a respected man, belonged there. But you're wrong. People like you are the ones who don't belong in this police force." Richard dropped his head, his last shred of composure dissolving. Ethan turned and strode out of the office, but not before pausing in the doorway. His voice, authoritative and firm, echoed behind him. "Get ready. You're going to face the truth and justice." The following day, in the main hearing room of the police department, a formal inquiry was convened. The large room was packed. Alongside the officers, representatives from Internal Affairs, and a few reporters were eyewitnesses from the diner, people who were prepared to testify against Richard Miller. The atmosphere was tense, punctuated only by the rustling of papers and whispers. At the center table, Richard sat with his head lowered, his face blank but his eyes betraying unease. Across from him was the inquiry panel, led by Sandra Walker, a seasoned Internal Affairs officer known for her no-nonsense approach. Beside her were senior officers, including Ethan Carter, whose gaze bore into Richard like a blade. Walker tapped her pen lightly on the table, silencing the room. Her voice was calm but commanding as she addressed the room. "We are gathered here today to investigate Officer Richard Miller's conduct in the incident at the diner yesterday. This hearing is to determine whether his actions violated departmental protocol and ethical standards. Our purpose is to uncover the truth and ensure that any wrongdoing is met with appropriate consequences." She turned to Richard, her sharp gaze pinning him. "Officer Miller, do you have anything to say before we begin?" Richard stood, adjusting his collar nervously. "Ma'am, members of the panel, I want to state that I was simply doing my duty. I acted to protect the community, and I had no intent to discriminate or misuse my authority." A murmur rippled through the room. In the front row, Henry sat with a composed expression, though his eyes reflected fatigue and quiet resolve. Ethan, seated among the panelists, didn't bother hiding his simmering anger, his fists clenched on the table. "Miss Anna," Walker continued, turning to the young waitress in the witness seat, "we understand you recorded a video of the incident. Are you prepared to present your account to the panel?" Anna nodded and stood, her hands trembling slightly as she held up her phone. "Yes, ma'am. I recorded the entire event. This is what happened," she said, her voice steady but laced with righteous indignation. She connected her phone to the large screen, and the video began to play. The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the screen. In the video, Richard could be seen confronting Henry, his voice carrying clearly, "You don't belong here. This is our place." The footage captured Richard pushing over Henry's coffee cup, spilling its contents onto his jacket, and then forcefully handcuffing him in front of stunned diners. When the video ended, the silence was heavier than before. Glances filled with anger and disdain were cast toward Richard. Walker turned to Anna. "Miss Anna, can you elaborate on what you witnessed?" Anna took a deep breath, her eyes locking firmly on Richard. "I was there from start to finish. Mr. Carter did nothing wrong. He was just sitting quietly, drinking coffee and waiting for his son. It was Officer Miller who caused the scene, deliberately humiliating him. Mr. Carter did not resist, but Miller acted aggressively and without any valid reason. An elderly woman, also a witness from the diner, stepped forward after Anna. "I saw the entire incident," she said. "Mr. Carter was very polite and quiet. It was Officer Miller who escalated things. He treated Mr. Carter as if he wasn't deserving of respect." Next, a middle-aged man, still visibly upset, took the stand. "This was unacceptable," he said. "The way Miller shoved Mr. Carter out of the diner, then handcuffed him in front of everyone. It wasn't just wrong, it was a disgrace to a veteran." The defense attorney turned to the judge, his sharp gaze steady but composed. "Your Honor," he began, his voice weighted with authority, "these testimonies not only illustrate the injustice Mr. Carter suffered, but also underscore the pressing need for accountability in our system. A man like Mr. Carter, who has sacrificed so much to serve his country, deserves dignity, not humiliation." The judge nodded slightly, his expression thoughtful. Beside him, Officer Miller showed clear signs of unease. His eyes darted nervously, and his hands, resting on the table, trembled faintly. The weight of the evidence and the mounting truth bore down on him, tightening the already oppressive atmosphere in the courtroom. The hearing room grew stifling after the panel concluded the presentation of evidence. Richard Miller sat motionless at the table, trying to project calm, but the anxiety was clear on his face. His clenched hands rested tightly in front of him as though holding on to the last threads of his confidence. Across from him, Sarah Collins, the sharp-eyed internal affairs representative, fixed her unwavering gaze on him. Leaning forward slightly, her voice steady and deliberate, Sarah said, "Richard Miller, it's time for you to answer honestly. What was your behavior in the diner yesterday? No excuses, no deflections. I want the truth from you." Richard lifted his head, his eyes meeting Sarah's penetrating stare and Ethan Carter's unyielding gaze from across the room. Swallowing hard, he cleared his throat, his voice betraying his nerves. I admit that my actions exceeded the limits of my authority." The room seemed to hold its breath at his admission. Sarah gave him no time to evade further. "Exceeded the limits? Be specific, Officer Miller. What did you do, and why?" Lowering his head, Richard's voice shrank as though trying to escape the moment. "I overreacted. I don't think I acted correctly. I was trying to maintain order in the diner." "Maintain order?" Sarah cut him off, her tone sharp. "You believe spilling coffee on a veteran, handcuffing him in a public diner, and using racially charged language is maintaining order? Is that what you call fulfilling your duty?" Richard's hands trembled, gripping the table tightly. "I didn't mean to hurt him." Ethan rose from his seat and strode toward Richard's table, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. "Didn't mean to hurt him? Richard, you didn't just hurt him. You damaged the integrity of this police force. Your actions weren't just an abuse of power. They were a display of prejudice and disrespect. That has no place here." Richard avoided Ethan's fiery gaze. I didn't know he was your father, Captain Carter." Leaning closer, Ethan's voice was steel. "It doesn't matter whether he's my father or not, Richard. What matters is that you didn't see him as a person. To you, He was just an inconvenience, a problem to be removed, and that is unacceptable. Sarah flipped through the notes in front of her, her gaze as sharp as a blade. Looking up, she addressed Richard directly. "Officer Miller, we've heard enough. Based on your admission, the video evidence, and witness testimony, I'm recommending immediate action. You are no longer fit to serve as a police officer. I propose your termination, effective immediately." Her words plunged the room into silence. The members of the disciplinary panel exchanged glances and then nodded in agreement. The chair of the panel, a stern-faced older man, turned to Richard and delivered the final decision. "Officer Richard Miller, the panel has decided to terminate your employment with the police department, effective immediately. Your actions represent a severe breach of professional ethics and have eroded public trust in this force." Richard lowered his head, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the verdict, his confidence entirely shattered. Sarah continued, her tone firm. "In addition to your termination, you will be subject to a full internal investigation. Your conduct at the diner shows potential legal violations, and this case will be referred to the district attorney's office. Prepare to face legal charges." Richard sat frozen, his face pale as though he'd just taken a direct blow. He understood now that not only his career was over, but far worse consequences awaited him. After the decision was finalized, Sarah invited Ethan to speak. Rising to his feet, Ethan moved to the front of the room, his eyes scanning the audience. His voice was steady and resolute as he began. "The police force is not just a group of law enforcers. We represent justice, respect, and the trust of the community. When an officer like Richard abuses his authority, he doesn't just harm an individual. He breaks the bond of trust that our community places in all of us." Ethan paused, taking a breath as his words settled in the room. "Never forget that the power we hold is not a weapon. It is a responsibility. If we fail to understand that, we are not worthy of the uniform we wear." The room was silent, save for the rustle of shifting bodies. Some officers lowered their heads in shame, while others nodded in agreement, recognizing the gravity of their role. The golden hues of sunset lingered, filtering through the trees and casting a serene glow outside Henry's modest home. Ethan parked his car in the driveway, but didn't step out immediately. He sat, gripping the steering wheel, his gaze fixed forward as the events of the day swirled in his mind, from the tense hearing to the haunting image of his father sitting in the holding cell. Finally, he exhaled deeply, opened the car door, and walked up the wooden steps to the porch. Henry was already sitting there, as though he had been waiting for his son. He looked up, a gentle smile spreading across his face, his eyes a mixture of warmth and pride. Ethan sat down on the old rocking chair next to his father, his hands resting on his knees, searching for the right words. "Dad," he began, his voice low but firm, "Richard has been fired, effective immediately. The panel didn't accept any of his excuses. Sarah also confirmed that he'll be investigated further. If there's enough evidence, he'll be prosecuted." Henry sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the yard where the streetlights had begun to glow. After a moment, he nodded slightly. "That's a fitting outcome," he said, his voice calm and even. "But this isn't just about punishing him, Ethan. What matters is that you did the right thing. You stood up, not just for me, but for justice." Ethan lowered his head, staring at his hands. His voice was tinged with regret. "Dad, I can't shake the feeling that I should have stopped this sooner. How could I have allowed someone like Richard to stay on my team?" Henry turned to his son, a soft smile on his face. "Ethan, don't blame yourself. You can't control everyone. I know you've done everything you could to build a good team, but you're not a mind reader and you're not infallible. What matters is that when this happened, you acted." Ethan looked up, his eyes clouded with sadness. "But you went through so much. Sitting in that diner, being humiliated, insulted. How did you stay so calm? If it were me, I don't think I could have endured it." Henry chuckled softly, his eyes glimmering with reflection. "Son, I've faced this kind of thing my entire life. I've lost count of how many times people looked at me as if I didn't belong, didn't deserve to sit at the table, wear the uniform, or have a place in this world." He paused, exhaling deeply as if releasing a heavy weight. "But I learned long ago that anger only clouds your judgment. Instead, I've chosen to prove them wrong by holding on to my values, by not letting them define who I am." Ethan sat in silence, his father's words washing over him. Finally, his voice broke slightly as he said, "Dad, I'm sorry I didn't get there sooner. I'm sorry you had to go through this." Henry placed a comforting hand on Ethan's shoulder, his eyes filled with understanding. "You don't need to apologize, Ethan. You came and you did what was right. That's all I ever hoped for. I don't expect you to shield me from every hardship. I just hope you'll always stand up for justice. And today, you did." Ethan nodded, his voice tinged with gratitude. "I just hope what I did today means something. I don't want anyone else to go through what you did." Henry nodded, his voice steady and reassuring. "Son, every small action makes a difference. You showed today that justice still matters and that people are willing to fight for it. That's what I'm most proud of." They sat quietly for a while, letting the gentle evening breeze rustle the leaves and the soft glow of stars fill the sky. Finally, Henry broke the silence, looking directly at Ethan. "Ethan, you're a good captain and an even better man. Don't ever let people like Richard make you doubt yourself. I've lived long enough to know change doesn't happen overnight. But each small step, each act like today's, builds a better future." Ethan stood, gazing at the starlit sky. "I promise, Dad. I'll make sure this never happens again, and I'll ensure my team always acts in the name of justice." Henry smiled, his pride unmistakable. "I've never doubted that. You've always been the person I trust the most." A few days after the incident at the police station, Henry Carter's story spread far beyond the small town, capturing national attention. The video showing Richard Miller's discriminatory actions ignited widespread outrage and heated discussions across social media platforms. At the same time, Henry's calm and resilience earned deep admiration and respect from the public. To express their gratitude and support, local community organizations, veterans, and residents decided to hold a tribute event honoring Henry, not just for his military service but for his steadfast stance against injustice. The town's Central Park was chosen as the venue. Hundreds of people worked together to prepare for the event, setting up a stage, arranging seating, and decorating the area with American flags and handmade banners. Slogans like, "Thank you, Henry Carter, a symbol of resilience," and "Stand against injustice, defend justice," were displayed prominently. A group of young volunteers curated large photos of Henry during his military service and placed them around the stage. These images not only celebrated his heroic past, but also highlighted his lifelong commitment to doing what was right. When Henry arrived at the park with Ethan, the waiting crowd erupted into applause. Cheers echoed across the area. Some held large signs reading, "We are proud of you." A group of children waved small American flags, honoring the man they had only heard about, but who had left an indelible impression. Henry looked overwhelmed, his eyes scanning the crowd as if unable to believe all of this was for him. Turning to Ethan, he said softly, "I didn't think people would make such a big deal out of this." Ethan smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. You deserve this, Dad. This isn't just about you, it's about everything you've stood for. Mark Hansen, a fellow veteran who had served with Henry, took the stage as the event's host. His voice was strong but tinged with emotion as he began, Today, we gather to honor someone truly remarkable, Henry Carter. Not just a veteran who sacrificed to protect this country, but a man who has never bowed to injustice. He is a role model for all of us. The crowd erupted into applause, many rising to their feet in admiration. Mark continued, Henry, today we honor not just your service during the war, but the dignity you maintained during the hardest moments. You've shown us all that resilience and integrity can triumph over any adversity. When Mark invited Henry to the stage, the crowd burst into cheers once more. Henry, tall and steady despite his years, walked slowly to the microphone. He paused, his eyes sweeping over the audience before he began. Henry started, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. I don't know what to say to express how I feel right now. I never thought I'd stand before such a crowd, and I certainly never expected to be honored like this. He paused, taking a deep breath, his eyes alight with determination. But this isn't just about me. This is about all of us. It's about what we can achieve when we stand together against injustice. I'm just an ordinary man, but your support today proves that true strength lies in community. The crowd fell silent, many nodding in agreement, their eyes reflecting deep emotion. As Henry stepped back, Ethan took the podium. His gaze swept the audience as he began, his voice clear and firm. I'm incredibly proud of my father. He's not just a veteran or a wonderful father. He's a symbol of resilience and justice. But today, I want to talk about all of us. Ethan paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Every day, we face challenges. But let's remember that any one of us, no matter how small we may feel, can make a difference. My father proved that, not with force, but with dignity and resolve. And I believe we can do the same. Looking directly at the crowd, Ethan's voice grew stronger. Let's keep fighting, not just for ourselves, but for those who cannot fight for themselves. Let's ensure that injustice and discrimination have no place in this community, or anywhere else. The event ended with a renewed sense of unity and pride. People lined up to shake Henry's hand, expressing their gratitude and admiration. Many shared how his story inspired them to reflect on their own lives and take positive action. As the event wound down, Henry and Ethan stood on the stage, watching the crowd disperse. Henry turned to his son and said quietly, Ethan, I don't know if I deserve all of this, but I'm so proud to have you by my side, always standing up for what's right. Ethan smiled, his eyes reflecting determination. I only learned it from you, Dad. You showed me that justice is never easy, but it's always worth fighting for. In the glow of the sunset, the image of father and son standing together, a symbol of resilience and a beacon of hope for a fairer future, left a lasting impression on everyone present. Following these pivotal events, the police department faced mounting pressure to implement systemic changes. Public outcry, community demands, and the voices of honest officers within the force pushed the department's leadership to act. Captain Ethan Carter, who had spearheaded the investigation into Richard Miller, took a central role in driving these reforms. From the outset, Ethan emphasized during a department-wide meeting, what happened to Mr. Henry Carter wasn't just the failure of one officer. It was a symptom of a systemic problem. As representatives of the law, we must take responsibility for rebuilding the community's trust. And that starts with us. Ethan's words were both a critique and a call to action. he demanded a comprehensive review of the department, not only of individual officers' performance, but also their attitudes, behavior, and interactions with the community. An independent oversight team was established, comprising representatives from internal affairs, human rights experts, and community members. This team was tasked with monitoring the department's internal operations, ensuring that no instances of abuse of power or discrimination could be concealed. One of Ethan's first initiatives was to implement in-depth training sessions for the entire police force. This program was divided into multiple phases, focusing on key areas. Officers participated in workshops focused on understanding and respecting cultural, racial, and religious diversity within the community. Experts in psychology and sociology were brought in to help officers understand the consequences of discriminatory behavior. Officers underwent real-life scenario training, simulating situations like the one involving Henry. These exercises aimed to teach them how to handle incidents professionally, calmly, and without bias. Regular meetings were organized between police officers and residents, fostering open dialogue about concerns and expectations. These sessions allowed the community to voice their opinions and helped bridge the gap between law enforcement and the public. One of Ethan's most significant moves was recognizing officers who demonstrated courage in standing against internal injustices. Among them was Jack Anderson, a young officer who had bravely reported Richard's misconduct. Jack became a symbol of a new generation of police officers. During a department-wide meeting, Ethan announced Jack's promotion. Standing at the podium, he spoke with conviction. Jack Anderson has shown that integrity and courage not only uphold justice, but also protect the honor of this department. He is a shining example, and I'm proud to announce his promotion to Deputy Patrol Leader. The room erupted in applause, but the emotion in Jack's eyes spoke louder than the clapping. Receiving his badge from Ethan, Jack said, his voice trembling slightly, "I'm honored to take on this responsibility, but this isn't just my accomplishment. This is the result of a team dedicated to building a better police force. I'll work tirelessly to live up to this trust." The reforms not only transformed the department's operations but also rekindled the community's hope for a better future. Police resident meetings became more frequent, fostering stronger relationships. Anna, the waitress who had filmed the diner incident, spoke at a community gathering. "I'm thrilled to see these changes. It gives us hope that one day everyone will be treated with equality and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." When Henry heard about Jack's promotion, he called to congratulate him. During their conversation, Henry said, "Jack, you deserve this. Not everyone dares to do what's right in tough situations. You not only stood up for me, but for the values this uniform represents." Jack responded with determination in his voice. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I will do everything I can to live up to your trust and Captain Carter's leadership. I hope that what we're doing today will pave the way for a better future." The police department's reforms not only transformed its operations, but also rekindled the community's faith in the potential for change and growth. Under Ethan's leadership, the department became more equitable, laying the groundwork for a new generation of officers. Individuals committed not only to enforcing the law but also to upholding the dignity of every person. The transformation began within the department, but its impact rippled throughout the community. With young officers like Jack and resolute leaders like Ethan, the vision of a better future no longer seemed out of reach. For Henry, filled with pride and emotion, the realization was clear. His fight had made a difference, not just for himself, but for generations to come. Nightfall brought an unusual calm after days of turmoil. Henry's house glowed softly under the porch light. Ethan pulled up in the driveway, holding a bottle of red wine, a favorite of his father's for quiet moments. The car door shut gently, and his footsteps crunched steadily on the gravel path, each step purposeful and firm. On the porch, Henry had been sitting for a while, the old rocking chair creaking softly under his weight. Seeing Ethan approach, he lifted his head and smiled faintly. "Son, isn't tonight your shift?" Ethan stepped onto the porch, setting the wine bottle on the small table beside his father. He eased into the empty chair next to him. "Tonight, you deserve company," he said warmly, though the weariness in his voice was unmistakable. Henry smiled, his gaze drifting to the sky beyond. "You've done well, Ethan," he began, his tone carrying the quiet wisdom of a man who had weathered many storms. "I know, it's not easy to stand against a system to do what's right, but you did it." Ethan sighed softly, his eyes tracing the stars above. "Dad, I can't stop thinking about what happened. I keep wondering, will what we've done today make a difference, or will things just go back to how they were?" Henry turned to his son, his eyes alight with conviction. "Ethan, change doesn't happen in a single moment. It takes time and persistence. You can't expect everything to transform overnight. But what you've done today is plant a seed of justice and trust. If you keep nurturing it, it will grow into something much greater." Ethan remained silent, as though weighing his father's words. After a moment, he asked, "Dad, how did you stay so strong all these years? You faced so much injustice, been looked down on so many times, yet you've never lost faith in justice." Henry chuckled lightly, though his smile held a hint of sadness. "Son, I wasn't always strong. There were times I wanted to give up, to lash out in anger, but I learned that anger doesn't change anything. It only clouds your judgment. What kept me going was the belief that if I didn't stand up, who would? And if not now, then when?" His gaze turned distant, his voice softening. "I think of my old comrades, those who sacrificed their lives for the values we're fighting to protect. They aren't here to continue the fight, but I am. I owe it to them. That's why I've never given up." Henry's words struck a deep chord in Ethan. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Dad, I promise you, I won't stop. What you endured won't happen to the next generation. I'll do everything I can to ensure that everyone, no matter their skin color or background, is treated fairly. I won't let you down." Henry smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "I believe in you, Ethan. You have the heart and determination of a true leader. You've shown that not just today, but in everything you've done." Ethan looked at his father, feeling a warmth and strength from his words. "Dad, I'm only continuing the path you've paved. You taught me about courage and integrity. Whatever I've accomplished, it's because of you." The two fell into a companionable silence, letting the night breeze carry the soft rustle of leaves around them. Ethan reached for the wine bottle, pouring 2 full glasses. He handed one to his father. "Let's toast, Dad, to everything we've achieved." Henry accepted the glass, shaking his head with a small laugh. "No, Ethan, let's toast to everything we will achieve, to the future we're building." Their glasses clinked softly, the sound carrying meaning in the stillness of the night. Henry stared into his wine, his expression thoughtful. "Son, remember this. The greatest change starts with the smallest actions. Every person and every act matters. Just trust in that and never give up." Ethan nodded, raising his glass higher. "To justice and better days ahead." Under the twinkling stars, the image of father and son, one a symbol of resilience, the other a beacon of hope, painted a scene of quiet yet profound inspiration. That night wasn't just a conversation between a father and his son. It was a moment of continuity, of values and beliefs passed from one generation to the next. The story closes with Ethan's promise and Henry's faith that the small steps taken today will lead to meaningful change tomorrow. In the silence beneath the starry sky, the two men sat together, embodiments of perseverance and determination, ready to continue their shared journey for justice. With Henry's resilience and Ethan's determination, this story isn't just about a personal struggle. It's a symbol of justice and hope. Do you believe Ethan's actions are enough to spark lasting change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like and share the video with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. See you next time.
It was a bright Monday morning in the bustling heart of Greenville, a place known for its historic stone courthouse, tree-lined boulevards, and steady hum of activity as people hurried to their jobs. Yet beneath the surface of warm hellos and polite nods, a simmering tension was about to ignite the kind of drama no one ever expects in a quiet, unassuming suburb. This is the story of Malcolm Duval, a talented, hard-working executive at a local marketing firm, who just happened to be deaf and black in a world that too often overlooks both. As he stepped off the morning bus and paused at a corner cafe for his usual espresso, Malcolm's sharp eyes picked up every subtle vibration and flicker of light in this familiar landscape. He couldn't hear the traffic rushing by or the murmur of chatter from people sipping their drinks on the sidewalk, but he felt something in the air that day, a palpable sense that something big and unsettling loomed just around the corner. Little did he know that his entire life was about to be turned upside down by one sudden, racially charged encounter with a man sworn to protect the very people he was about to intimidate. Sergeant Bradley Timmons, a white police officer with a reputation for making mountains out of molehills, was stationed just across the street, looking for any sign of trouble. His mind was restless, propelled by his usual paranoia and an undercurrent of prejudice that lurked just behind his practiced smile. As Malcolm approached the crosswalk, Timmons's gaze latched onto him like a predator fixating on prey, and though Malcolm couldn't sense the quickening pulse in Timmons's temple, he could certainly see the rigid posture and that unmistakable glare. In Timmons's mind, Malcolm's mere presence was reason enough to keep a suspicious eye on him. But when Malcolm failed to respond to the officer's curt shout, completely unaware of the sound due to his deafness, that was all it took to spark an ill-fated confrontation. The wheels of fate began to turn as Timmons marched toward Malcolm, ignoring all common sense, closing in with an angry demand that Malcolm couldn't hear. Passers-by slowed, their curiosity piqued, but no one expected what happened next. Timmons grabbed Malcolm by the shoulder with a force that made those who saw it gasp, then spewed a string of condescending remarks, all because Malcolm didn't react to his commands. Malcolm, realizing the hostility, tried to explain with gestures and a calm look, attempting to convey that he was deaf. His hands signed desperately for clarity, but Timmons's narrow mind saw only defiance. In a flash, Timmons snapped his handcuffs around Malcolm's wrists, dragging him toward the squad car, leveling accusations of disobedience and contempt. Stunned onlookers watched the whole fiasco, as shock rippled through the crowd at the sight of this blatant abuse of power. Whispers filled the air. Why is he arresting him? And he can't even hear. But Timmons's ears burned with racist indignation, and there was no reasoning with him now. So began a chain of events that would escalate far beyond this bustling street corner, a domino effect propelled by prejudice and ignorance. What none of these bystanders could have predicted was how this moment of injustice would end up in the hallowed halls of that very same old stone courthouse that witnessed decades of trials, and that what would happen there would be so astonishing, so spine-tingling, that it would not only rip the mask off Timmons's true nature, but also send shockwaves through the entire Greenville community. The question on everyone's lips was simple. Would Malcolm, a man used to adversity but never expecting such blatant cruelty, be crushed by the system, Or would he stand his ground in a way that exposed Timmons's wrongdoing for all to see? The morning sun glinted off the shiny handcuffs as Timmons shoved Malcolm into the squad car, little realizing that this single act of unwarranted aggression was setting the stage for a battle that would resonate throughout the city and beyond. A hush fell over the onlookers as Timmons pushed Malcolm into the cramped back seat of the police cruiser, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the windows. With his wrists still cuffed, Malcolm's mind raced. He had felt waves of prejudice before, but something in Timmons's eyes was colder and more disturbing than any past encounter. The officer had come at him so fast, so aggressively, that it was almost surreal, a nightmare in broad daylight. The scenario brought back memories of the occasional stares and hushed discussions Malcolm endured when he was growing up. Folks who underestimated him not just because of his skin color, but because he couldn't hear. Yet despite the heartbreak each incident brought, Malcolm always managed to maintain his composure, to cling to the calm determination that had carried him through every challenge life hurled his way. This time, however, those same qualities were being tested like never before, and even as he sat in the confined space of the squad car, he found his thoughts drifting to the irony of it all. A deaf executive who had dreamed of bridging communication gaps now found himself utterly silenced by a man sworn to uphold justice. The ride to the station felt endless, each minute filled with Timmons's glances into the rear-view mirror, narrow-eyed, filled with unspoken accusations. Malcolm's heart pounded not with fear but a controlled fury at the injustice of the entire situation. He could not hear the engine, only sensed the vibration of the vehicle as it lurched forward, and the dull throb of the city traffic passing by. He tried to sign a question about the charges, but Timmons only sneered, muttering something under his breath that Malcolm couldn't make out even if he had been able to hear. The officer radiated arrogance, reveling in the twisted power of the moment. Malcolm briefly closed his eyes and envisioned himself strolling into his office in the marketing firm with a confident smile, greeting his coworkers with polite nods and sign language. It was such a stark contrast to now, being forcibly hauled to a police station for no wrongdoing, simply because of a single fleeting encounter that spiraled out of control. The memory of that carefree morning bus ride was still fresh in his mind, reminding him of how a normal day could derail in the blink of an eye. When the cruiser finally jerked to a stop, Timmons yanked Malcolm out, practically dragging him across the pavement into the drab, fluorescent, lit corridor of the station. The gray walls, the squeak of boots on the tile floor, the stale smell of coffee all converged into a sensory landscape Malcolm observed only through his keen eyes and the faint vibrations underfoot. As they passed other officers who cast curious or disapproving looks, Malcolm thought he saw a flash of empathy from a few, as though they recognized something fundamentally wrong in how Timmons was handling the situation. But Timmons was too wrapped up in his own indignation to notice or care. He marched Malcolm straight into a dimly lit holding room where a desk sergeant stood waiting with a clipboard. The older man behind the desk was about to ask a routine question, but Timmons cut him off, announcing with triumph. He resisted every command and refused to cooperate. Malcolm quickly lifted his hands, trying to sign that he was deaf, but Timmons scoffed, forcibly pushing his arms down as the sergeant's eyebrows rose in concern. For a moment, the air was heavy with tension as Timmons and the sergeant locked eyes, the latter clearly wondering if there was more to the story. Nonetheless, in the mechanical routine of processing, Malcolm was forced to remove personal items from his pockets, to sign paperwork he could barely read under the stress, and to stand for mugshots that revealed the calm but resolute determination in his eyes, the entire demeaning. Procedure felt surreal, almost as if he were watching someone else's life unfolding. His mind kept returning to the question, how did this happen so quickly, and how was he going to make anyone believe he hadn't acted out? As they led him away, he thought of the day he learned to advocate for himself in college, to fight for proper accommodations in class, to hold his head high against stares on the street and in board meetings. That sense of unwavering self-worth sparked inside him like a small, steady flame, and he vowed that no matter what happened next, he would stand up for himself, even if the world seemed stacked against him. Unknown to Malcolm, several bystanders from the cafe and the street corner were already buzzing with indignation on social circles beyond his reach, emails, neighborhood calls, face-to-face discussions in apartment lobbies. People who had witnessed the shocking arrest were determined to make noise, to show that someone had to speak up. Meanwhile, at the station, Timmins was forging ahead with booking Malcolm, as though it were the simplest task in the world, blissfully unaware that what he was doing would soon peel away any facade of righteousness he clung to. Through the thick walls of the precinct, the labyrinth of protocol, and the arrogance of one bigoted cop, the gears were already in motion for a day in court that would transform everything. Yet for now, in that claustrophobic holding cell, Malcolm felt the weight of the injustice crushing down on him, pondering whether anyone would realize he couldn't have possibly ignored Timmins in the first place. If only Timmins had chosen to ask a simple question or show a shred of compassion, they might have averted this entire episode. Instead, a spark of racism had ignited an inferno of consequences, and Malcolm found himself in the eye of a storm that was only just beginning. Locked up in the holding cell for hours, Malcolm watched as the afternoon sun sank behind the barred window, his mind racing with thoughts of how absurdly unfair it was that, for no valid reason beyond one officer's narrow-minded assumptions, he now found himself cut off from the outside world. The stinging truth was that Timmins hadn't bothered to ask any real questions or even try to communicate. Instead, he had simply pounced as though Malcolm were guilty of some secret offense. Malcolm wanted nothing more than to tell his own story, to make his voice understood in a language that needed only the movement of his hands, the movement of his eyes, his expressions. Yet he was stuck, reliant on the meager goodwill of the station staff to help him convey that he was deaf, a fact that, if acknowledged from the start, would have completely upended Timmins's flimsy justification for this arrest. And so he paced the cramped cell, feeling the vibrating echo of every distant slam of a door, the rumble of people's footsteps on the other side of the walls. He considered what might happen if he tried to fight this injustice alone. He was no stranger to hardship. As a bright kid hailing from a humble part of town, he'd learned to read people, adapt to new environments, and make his mark by sheer persistence, never letting his deafness become a hindrance to his dreams. He had spent countless late nights in college perfecting presentations he delivered through interpreters, refusing to let anyone label him as incapable. Eventually, his diligence earned him a top position at his marketing firm. But even that success didn't insulate him from the kind of bias that could bubble up from the ugliest corners of society, as he was finding out in the worst possible way. Eventually, an officer who wasn't Timmins approached him, a younger man, clearly uneasy with the situation, holding a clipboard in one hand. Malcolm gestured that he needed someone fluent in sign language, or at the very least an interpreter, but the officer shook his head apologetically and motioned for Malcolm to follow him. To another room, this new room offered a small desk and a single chair, walls made of cinder block and a fluorescent light that flickered ominously overhead. Malcolm was guided to the seat, and the officer began to write questions on a piece of paper. Do you understand why you're here? Do you know the charges being brought against you? Malcolm felt his frustration build, yet he steadied himself, carefully writing down that he had been arrested without cause and that he had tried to tell Timmins he was deaf, but the officer didn't listen. The younger officer read the note, tapping his pen against his teeth in a nervous gesture. He finally scribbled a reply. I'll have to talk to the sergeant. This seems like a misunderstanding. Malcolm could only give him a resolute nod, grateful for the glimmer of humanity yet anxious about whether any of this would lead to real justice. Meanwhile, in a far corner of the station, Timmins sat at a desk scribbling his version of events into a police report. He described Malcolm as defiant and hostile, weaving details out of thin air to protect his own pride, his prejudice swirling beneath the surface. Though Timmins didn't quite frame it in explicit racial terms, his choice of phrasing and the way he emphasized Malcolm's supposed reluctance to comply betrayed the glaring truth. Timmins had never granted Malcolm the courtesy of being innocent until proven guilty, simply because Malcolm was different in a way that Timmins chose not to acknowledge. With each word he wrote, Timmins practically relished the thought of seeing Malcolm squirm in court. Of course, he wasn't counting on the fact that multiple witnesses from that busy street corner had already taken note of his hateful remarks and bullying behavior. They hadn't merely stood by. Some, particularly a kindly middle-aged teacher who had been sipping coffee at the cafe, had quietly stepped up to share their accounts of what actually happened. Back inside the station, Malcolm was escorted back to a holding cell, acutely aware that every minute ticking by gave Timmins more time to set the narrative against him. It was a helpless feeling, reminiscent of moments in his past when he'd had to fight tooth and nail to prove himself simply because people made assumptions, like that old high school instructor who believed a deaf student couldn't keep up with advanced coursework, or that narrow-minded neighbor who silently questioned his capability every time he saw Malcolm leaving for work. But Malcolm refused to despair. He had a calm steel in his heart that never wavered, and he knew he had truth on his side. He also knew that if he kept his composure, the law, which at least in principle was supposed to be fair, would see through Timmons's web of lies. Let Timmons spin whatever story he wanted, Malcolm thought. The facts and the truth were in plain sight for anyone with eyes willing to see. But as the night wore on, the demands of the booking process continued, filling Malcolm's mind with a tight ache of exhaustion, worry, and longing for the outside world. Even so, while Timmons might have thought he was orchestrating a flawless takedown, there were ripples out in Greenville that the officer couldn't control. A low, key uproar was unfolding among everyday folks who had witnessed the arrest, sparking conversations in offices, convenience stores, and in living rooms, with people raising questions about how such a thing could happen. Those who had seen the panic on Malcolm's face when Timmons first grabbed him knew for certain the arrest had been unwarranted. They also recognized that Timmons had practically ignored the fact that Malcolm was deaf, something that was clear to anyone paying half attention to Malcolm's urgent gestures. Back in his cell, Malcolm remained unaware of these growing whispers, but he sensed that truth had a way of surfacing, especially when so many bystanders had seen the ugliness firsthand. He let that thought settle in, his chest like a calming weight, reminding himself that even though he was physically confined, the facts were not, and sooner or later they would come to light. One thought kept him tethered to hope: the day he'd finally step foot in the courthouse, able to explain his side of the story, to sign every detail in front of a judge who might actually listen, an arena where Timmons wouldn't have the last word. If Timmons believed he could bury Malcolm in the system, he was about to find out that the truth was far more persistent than he ever imagined. Inside the station, the night dragged on in a swirl of fluorescent lights, clacking computer keys, and the low hum of distant conversations, all of which reached Malcolm only as silent movements beyond the bars of his holding cell. It was well past the dinner hour by the time a different officer came by with a tray of lukewarm food, sliding it through the metal slot with a polite nod that momentarily softened Malcolm's guarded expression. He tried to express thanks with a small wave of his cuffed hand, but he couldn't help reflecting on how contradictory it felt to receive this fleeting kindness from one officer, even as he remained imprisoned due to the hateful actions of another. Eventually they uncuffed him, leaving him to sit on a hard bench in the cell, where he stared at the peeling paint on the walls and thought about the life that awaited him outside. Colleagues who would surely wonder why he hadn't shown up at the firm, friends who must be out there, possibly searching for him or trying to figure out what had gone wrong. Would they believe it was simply a mix-up that started because someone presumed the worst about a deaf black man? His heart pounded with a determined rhythm as he vowed that no matter how exhausted he felt, he would not crumble under Timmons's false accusations. He was not going to let this situation reduce him to a stereotype or shatter his self-worth. Gradually, he found himself conjuring every ounce of poise and intelligence that had helped him navigate countless misunderstandings in the past, clinging to the image of himself standing before a judge and using each sign, each expression, to make the truth resound louder than words ever could. Somewhere down the hall, Timmons was still in the building, likely confident that he had everything under control, conjuring up his twisted version of what happened on that sidewalk. But Timmons's brazen assurance stemmed from a place of deep-seated prejudice, and such prejudice often blinds people to the consequences of their own actions. He didn't seem to care about the growing whispers from other officers who felt uneasy at the sight of Malcolm's evident shock and distress when he was brought in. Nor did he care about the bystanders who had already started telling anyone who would listen about the glaring injustice they had witnessed. He simply carried himself with a smugness that suggested he believed Malcolm's deafness and skin color would be enough to cast doubt on any defense Malcolm might muster in court. Yet Timmons was unaware that people in Greenville were often slow to anger, but once roused, they rarely forgot a wrong. So he didn't realize that a storm was building that would put him under a harsh spotlight, exposing each lie he had told in his official report and dismantling the shield of false righteousness he wrapped around himself. Meanwhile, perched on the stiff bench, Malcolm replayed every moment of the arrest in his mind, recalling with perfect clarity how rapidly Timmins had escalated the situation. Malcolm had encountered subtle racism before, but never had he been manhandled and humiliated so brazenly by a uniformed officer of the law. More than once, his thoughts flickered back to his formative experiences, like that time he had single-handedly turned a classroom debate upside down by calmly countering every ignorant remark with well-researched facts, delivered through an interpreter, who helped him articulate his brilliant mind, that memory fed into his current resolve, a reminder that while the world might occasionally underestimate or mistreat him, he could always lean on his intellect and unwavering composure. With a long exhale, he began to strategize how to present his story once he finally got his day in court. Perhaps the judge would see through Timmins's deliberate disregard for Malcolm's disability. Perhaps the other officers who had shown flickers of discomfort would speak up about what they saw. Perhaps the teacher who had been sipping coffee at the cafe, or the other folks who bore witness, would come forward, adding their accounts to the mounting evidence. If Timmins believed for 1 second that a deaf black man wouldn't fight back against such injustice, he was sorely mistaken. Every muscle in Malcolm's body felt coiled like a spring, not out of aggression, but out of the unstoppable drive to defend his dignity. As the night deepened, the glow of distant streetlights cast strange patterns against the barred window, and Malcolm's eyes scanned those shifting shapes, thinking of the next sunrise, how, in a few short hours, he might be standing before a judge, a trembling yet determined figure, poised to unmask the blatant wrongs he had endured. The only question that remained was whether the justice system would side with the truth, or if it too would fail to see past the same biases that had nearly crushed him all day. Outside, Greenville seemed to settle into a calm hush, its quiet streets belied by the tension simmering below the surface, because tomorrow word would continue to spread about what had happened, and those who yearned for fairness would not be silent. In that subtle silence that only a deaf man could fully grasp, Malcolm closed his eyes and let his breathing steady, promising himself that he would not allow anger to rule him. Instead, he would channel his conviction and resourcefulness to ensure that Timmins's assault on his rights would not be swept under the rug. The next day would mark the beginning of a legal battle that Timmins never anticipated, and each step toward that courthouse brought Malcolm closer to a reckoning that would echo throughout the town, and ultimately beyond it. Dawn brought a pale light spilling through the narrow window of Malcolm's cell, signaling the start of a day that felt as though it held the weight of fate itself. The clank of metal against metal awakened him from fitful dozing, and he lifted his head to see yet another officer, not Timmins, unlocking the barred door and motioning for him to stand. Malcolm's muscles ached from the cold, unforgiving bench, but he pulled himself upright, ran a hand over his tired eyes, and forced his thoughts into composure. This was the day he would finally step out of these drab confines and into the courtroom, that hulking stone edifice in the center of Greenville, where decisions that shaped lives were handed down with a gavel's echo. He had barely slept, mind churning with questions. Would the judge listen? Would witnesses come forward to tell the truth? Would Timmins manage to twist the story even further? Stepping into the hallway, Malcolm felt a wave of relief that at least he was no longer under Timmins's sneering gaze. The officer who escorted him now maintained a respectful distance, perhaps having heard unsettling rumors about the arrest, or seen the raw disbelief in Malcolm's eyes. Yet for every hint of sympathy, there was still that thick barrier of silence. Malcolm couldn't communicate beyond what he could sign or jot down, and this station had made no effort to find him an interpreter. He consoled himself with the knowledge that in court, procedures were different. There would be legal obligations to ensure he could fully understand the proceedings and respond in turn. He clung to that fact with the determination of a man who refused to be misunderstood any longer. As they brought him to the transport van, a flood of sunlight momentarily dazzled him, and for a fleeting second he felt a wash of gratitude for something as simple as fresh air. 2 uniformed officers helped him inside, neither of them Timmins, and this small grace was enough to slow his racing heartbeat. The vehicle rumbled away, carrying Malcolm through the streets of Greenville. From the barred window, he glimpsed people bustling on their way to work, parents leading children by the hand, cafe owners sweeping sidewalks. He thought of how just yesterday he'd been one of those people, free and moving about his day, unaware of how quickly the rug could be pulled out from under him by a single hateful decision. Now, in less than 24 hours, he was en route to the courthouse, chained by the consequences of Timmons's arrogance. Still, with every block the van passed, his resolve grew stronger. If Timmons had hoped the indignity of jail would shatter his spirit, he was destined to be disappointed. Soon enough, the looming gray structure of the courthouse came into view, a place Malcolm had passed many times, but never dreamed he'd enter under such dire circumstances. Its ancient columns and solemn facade gave it a gravity that sent a shiver through him, yet he felt something else in his chest, the flicker of hope that truth could still triumph in a place designed, at least in theory, to weigh the facts of every dispute. Upon arriving, the officers led him past the swirl of attorneys and visitors milling around the entrance, many of whom cast curious, sometimes pitying, glances at Malcolm. As he entered, a twinge of recognition sparked across a few faces, individuals who had heard last night's rapidly spreading rumor. A deaf black man arrested for ignoring an officer's orders that he could never have heard, accused of resisting an arrest he never invited. In hushed hallways, the teacher from the cafe stood off to the side, clutching a stack of folders to her chest and watching Malcolm go by with a pained expression. She was already determined to tell the judge exactly what she had seen on that sidewalk, if only she had the chance. Others who had witnessed the cruelty were either present or had sent statements, stirring a small current of righteous outrage that was quietly weaving its way through Greenville's office break rooms, barber shops, and corner stores. At that moment Malcolm couldn't see them all, but something in the air told him he was not alone, that somewhere in this building, or maybe nearby, there were people prepared to speak out on his behalf. As he was guided through the corridors and into a waiting area, he caught a glimpse of Sergeant Timmons. The officer stood by the prosecutor's table, leafing through a few documents and occasionally glancing at Malcolm with that same disdainful curl of the lip. Timmons flashed a look so smug it made Malcolm's stomach lurch, but he refused to break eye contact, lifting his chin with quiet defiance. If Timmons was expecting to see fear, he'd find none here. Malcolm's pulse throbbed with anger, true, but also with a keen understanding that once he was in front of the judge, mere bullying wouldn't be enough to silence him. He would tell his side, sign by sign, detail by detail, ensuring everyone in that courtroom realized how easily Timmons had jumped to conclusions fueled by bigotry. The bailiff soon led Malcolm to a seat at a long wooden bench, granting him a moment of pause before the judge appeared. An interpreter, alerted by the court's obligation, stepped up next to him, introducing herself with swift, precise signs. The relief that washed over Malcolm at having someone to help him communicate was almost overwhelming, but he kept his composure. He gave a firm nod, steeled his posture, and began formulating how he'd present the story that Timmons was so desperate to distort. Outside the courtroom, muffled voices rose and fell, and Malcolm braced himself to walk into that chamber where his every gesture would be on display. He was used to being watched, deaf people often were, but this time he wasn't simply performing a presentation for a client or meeting with business partners. He was battling against a lie that threatened his freedom and his sense of justice. Every fiber in his body told him that the moment he stepped up to testify, the real conflict would begin. Timmons might believe his uniform gave him a protective shield, but truth, resilience, and the growing chorus of witnesses were poised to tear that shield apart. Yet even knowing that, Malcolm also understood how these things could go. Sometimes prejudice and power swayed rulings in ways that defied logic. So he steadied himself, summoning that distinct combination of strength and intelligence that had always driven him forward. Because if there was any glimmer of fairness left in Greenville's judiciary, this was his chance to make it shine, and Timmons would be forced to confront, perhaps for the first time, the consequences of his racist actions. Malcolm's pulse was hammering by the time he was led into the courtroom, though he managed to keep his face composed and his posture upright. The space itself felt like a grand theater of judgment, its high ceilings and carved wooden paneling designed to instill a sense of gravitas and awe in anyone who stepped inside. The judge, a dignified figure with silver, streaked hair, peered down from the bench with a mix of sternness and curiosity, clearly aware of the unusual circumstances that had already set tongues wagging among courthouse staff. The low hum of voices from observers and the shuffle of attorneys' papers was all lost on Malcolm's ears, but he could see the tension in their tight shoulders and darting eyes, and he could certainly feel the undercurrent of unease that floated through the room. With the court interpreter by his side, he stared ahead at Sergeant Timmons, who stood near the prosecutor's table, casually resting one hand on his belt, as though the entire proceeding was a trivial errand. Timmons had that same smug expression twisting his features, the same glint in his eye that Malcolm recognized from the street corner when the officer first accosted him. Malcolm sensed that Timmons likely believed the entire hearing would bend to his will, that the badge on his uniform and the allusions he'd spun into his official report would suffice to paint Malcolm as a threat. But as the judge called the proceedings to order, and the interpreter carefully signed each sentence into Malcolm's hands, a flicker of hope ignited in Malcolm's chest. This was not the police station, not a dimly lit interrogation room where Timmons could silence him at will. This was the domain of law, where, at least in principle, every voice had a chance to be heard, even the one Timmons had tried so desperately to muzzle. Almost immediately, Timmons's testimony began, and to Malcolm's horror, the officer recited a litany of untrue statements. According to Timmons, Malcolm had locked eyes with him on the sidewalk and purposefully ignored him, then made a series of hostile gestures that Timmons interpreted as intent to escalate violence. Timmons conveniently omitted any mention of Malcolm's deafness, instead describing a scenario in which Malcolm's body language and refusal to comply forced Timmons to take swift action. From her elevated seat, the judge raised an eyebrow, seeming to sense an inconsistency in the story, and Malcolm caught sight of the teacher from the café, Miss Grant, as he later learned, subtly shaking her head in disbelief from the row of witnesses. The silence in the room as Timmons finished speaking was charged with tension, a suffocating hush that seemed to hang on the judge's next words. Then came the moment for Malcolm's defense, and the interpreter gave Malcolm the smallest nod of encouragement before turning to face the judge. Everything about the next few minutes would define how the court perceived the truth behind what had happened, and Malcolm steeled himself to reveal, with clarity and dignity, exactly how Timmons had twisted events. Through the interpreter, Malcolm explained that he could not have possibly ignored Timmons's vocal commands because he never heard them. He described the sudden grip on his shoulder, the hateful slurs Timmons had hurled in the heat of the moment, words that various bystanders had heard and that Malcolm had glimpsed from Timmons's expression, words that reeked of racism. A ripple of shock went through some corners of the courtroom as Malcolm systematically dismantled Timmons's account, refusing to let anger or bitterness color his statements, focusing instead on clear recollections, the time he tried to sign, to explain his deafness, to show Timmons his hearing aids. He never once broke Timmons's gaze during that explanation, letting the officer see that the days of being silent or cowed were over. And each time Malcolm needed to emphasize a point, like that Timmons never bothered to communicate in writing or gestures, that Timmons never paused to consider an alternative explanation for Malcolm's perceived defiance. He turned to the interpreter with pointed expressions that made his indignation and clarity ring out in every sign. While Timmons glowered from across the room, the judge's expression grew increasingly grave, and from the corner of his eye, Malcolm caught sight of the bailiff quietly stepping away to speak in hushed tones with another officer, possibly verifying some detail of Malcolm's story. Finally, the judge requested to hear from any witnesses present, and Miss Grant wasted no time stepping forward. Her account came pouring out, how she'd been sipping her latte near the café when she saw Timmons accost Malcolm without warning, how Timmons yanked Malcolm by the arm and spat words that reeked of racist contempt, how Malcolm appeared astonished and tried to sign to the officer. Her words were eloquent and passionate, and Malcolm felt a surge of warmth in his chest, grateful that someone who had no obligation to get involved was willingly exposing the truth. Another witness, a middle-aged artist who sold sketches on the corner, testified that it was clear from Malcolm's panic gestures that he was deaf, a detail Timmons seemed to downright ignore or even exploit in his manic rush to place Malcolm under arrest. As these voices joined the record, Timmons began to fidget, crossing and uncrossing his arms, tapping his foot against the tile floor, his confidence clearly wavering as the judge absorbed every damning piece of information. Yet Timmons attempted one more act of defiance, mumbling something to the prosecutor, who then tried to discredit the witnesses by suggesting they had a personal bias against law enforcement. But Miss Grant calmly clarified that she'd been a teacher for nearly 2 decades, that she'd always supported fair policing, and that what she couldn't support was a blatant abuse of power. The judge nodded gravely, taking careful notes while the prosecutor's questions seemed to falter in the face of undeniable eyewitness testimony. Malcolm said little throughout this ordeal beyond calmly restating that he had never been asked about his deafness, never been given a chance to explain himself, never even been told the alleged reason for the officer's hostility. He let the truth speak through the facts, Timmons's unwavering refusal to communicate, his forceful arrest, his vile remarks, and as the testimonies drew to a close, the tension reached a peak so palpable that even Malcolm, who couldn't hear a pin drop, could feel its vibrations coursing through the courtroom floor. While the final verdict had yet to be pronounced, a shift had already taken place in the air. Timmons's narrative was unraveling, replaced by a dawning realization among nearly everyone in that chamber that this supposed threat in front of them was nothing more than a proud, intelligent, and deaf man who had been brutalized because of one cop's racist assumptions. Malcolm sat back in his seat, a knot of nerves still twisting in his gut, knowing that what would come next could either validate his experience or crush it. But one thing was sure, Timmons's arrogance had taken a blow, and the weight of mounting evidence hovered like a shadow that was about to overtake him. As the judge diligently reviewed the written statements and referenced them with the testimony heard that day, Malcolm could practically sense the tension crackling through the courtroom. He watched the slow, careful movements of the judge's eyes as they scanned each page, and every so often the judge's stern gaze would flick in Timmons's direction. The interpreter next to Malcolm maintained a professional, steady posture, but Malcolm noticed her hands trembling slightly when she lowered them to rest on the table, as if she, too, could feel the harrowing energy that stretched across the room like a taut wire ready to snap. For Malcolm, the process seemed almost surreal. He was finally telling his side of the story, communicating with his entire being, having his truth laid bare before people who, until this moment, knew him only as a name on police paperwork. Now they saw him as he really was, a man who navigated daily life by reading expressions, by feeling the vibrations of footsteps on the sidewalk, by scanning the environment with an almost preternatural vigilance. And for all Timmons's talk, none of it altered the fact that the officer had never once paused to consider that Malcolm's silence was anything but blatant disregard. There was a brief recess as the judge excused herself to chambers to review certain documents further, which gave Malcolm a moment to rest in the stiff wooden chair and reflect on how everything had taken such a dramatic turn in just a single day. He cast a glance toward Miss Grant, who sat a few rows back, clasping her hands together, her face etched with the weariness of someone who had decided to do the right thing regardless of the inconvenience. Next to her, the middle-aged artist kept looking toward Malcolm with a calm, reassuring nod. Scattered around the room were a handful of other onlookers, some possibly acquaintances of Timmons, others simply curious about the case, and still more from the community who had heard whispers of a deaf man arrested under puzzling and disturbing circumstances. Every minute that passed made it clearer that Timmons could no longer rely on the vague shield of law and order. The evidence was mounting that he had crossed a line so blatant that no minor technicalities could brush it under the rug. Timmons himself glowered near the prosecutor, whose once confident posture was now replaced by a certain stiffness, as though he was unsure how to salvage this situation. Malcolm noticed that Timmons's hand intermittently clenched and relaxed at his side, a telling gesture of unease. In the stifling hush of that moment, Malcolm considered the countless hurdles he'd faced in life, from simple social events where people ignored him because they didn't know sign language, to professional boardrooms where colleagues assumed he couldn't manage negotiations because he was deaf. Yet nothing compared to the chilling power Timmons had exercised on that sidewalk, and for once Malcolm felt a dawning sense that this systemic cruelty, so often dismissed, had finally found a spotlight it could not escape. All Timmons's smug self, assurance had led him to believe that people would just take his word at face value, especially if he described Malcolm in the worst possible light. But more than one person in that courtroom had glimpsed the raw truth, and more than one witness had recounted how Timmons's actions were tainted by racism and fueled by a refusal to acknowledge a disability that was as plain as day. Eventually, the bailiff's steady voice reverberated through the chamber, indicating the judge was returning to the bench. The stiff rustling of attire filled the air as people rose, then sat again when the judge motioned for them to do so. Malcolm's insides coiled with anticipation, his face stoic, but his heart pounding like a drum. He had faced adversity before, but never with quite such high stakes, and never within these cavernous halls where so many stories of justice and injustice had played out. The judge looked at Timmins, then at Malcolm, then back at the pages of notes in front of her. Clearing her throat, she began to address the room, detailing how the testimonies, both written and spoken, presented a starkly different narrative than the police report had laid out. She mentioned inconsistencies in Timmins's version of events, the curious omission of Malcolm's deafness in the official documentation, and the multiple independent witnesses who saw no provocation for the arrest, just an officer acting with unreasonable aggression. Each of her words was signed into Malcolm's line of vision by the interpreter, and with every sign, a tremor of relief and validation rippled through him. Just then, to Malcolm's surprise, the door at the rear of the courtroom opened, and a man in a crisp suit slid quietly inside. Malcolm recognized him as one of the senior partners from the marketing firm where he worked. Though they weren't close friends, this man had always shown him a level of respect and equality that felt genuine. That he would show up here, in the middle of a workday, to observe these proceedings spoke volumes about how quickly the word had spread among those who cared. A faint glimmer of encouragement lit Malcolm's eyes, though nothing was decided yet. It was comforting to have at least one familiar face in the crowd, proof that Malcolm's entire life and identity extended beyond this messy legal battle. The judge continued, describing the seriousness of the allegations of misconduct against Timmins. Then, as if sensing the growing tension, she said that a decision about immediate steps would be forthcoming, and that she wished to hear a final statement from Malcolm himself. The court interpreter turned to him and signed the request. Summoning the fortitude that had carried him through so many trials before, Malcolm rose to his feet, his shoulders drawn back, head held high, and began signing his statement about the day of the arrest, how he'd stepped off the bus, headed for a routine stop at the cafe, and how Timmins had loomed into his path, hurling commands that Malcolm never heard. He recounted that first wave of confusion, the brutal moment Timmins latched onto his shoulder, and the sinking dread when he realized the officer couldn't be bothered to see reason. Through it all, he kept his tone measured, not emotional. Malcolm didn't shy away from describing the humiliation or the fear, but he also made sure the court understood that at no point had he lashed out or attempted to resist in the way Timmins alleged. His only offense was his deafness, something Timmins had neither respected nor tried to accommodate. As the interpreter's voice gave sound to his words, the judge leaned forward, taking in every sign, every nuance in Malcolm's expression. From the corner of his vision, Malcolm noticed Timmins shift from one foot to the other, crossing his arms defensively, clearly sensing a tide turning against him. Malcolm concluded by stating, through the interpreter, that while he believed most officers did their best to serve the community, what Timmins did violated every principle of justice. He asked the judge to recognize the gravity of that violation, not just for himself, but for anyone who might find themselves at the mercy of someone too blinded by bias to do their job fairly. A hush followed those final signs. The tension in the air now felt like the charged atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Malcolm sank back down into his seat, exhaling slowly as the judge prepared to speak again. He realized that in this moment his dignity was no longer in question. He had reclaimed it, standing firm in the face of Timmins's attempts to portray him as a criminal. Now, all that remained was for the legal system to either uphold that dignity or toss it aside. The next moments would set the stage for the final verdict, and for how Timmins would have to account for his racist actions, which had led to an unwarranted arrest and shattered illusions of justice in one quiet Greenville suburb. And as Malcolm folded his hands, he felt no regret about how he had handled this fight. He had refused to let anger consume him, had chosen instead a clear, unwavering route that revealed who he was: strong, intelligent, resilient. With the entire courtroom watching and Timmins squirming under the weight of the facts, Malcolm held his breath, waiting for the judge to pronounce what might be a pivotal moment of accountability, or yet another infuriating reminder that justice isn't always blind. The entire courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath as the judge, her voice clear and resonant through the interpreter's steady signs, announced her ruling in a measured tone that echoed across the silent room. She explained, point by point, that Sergeant Timmons's testimony was riddled with contradictions and prejudice, and she went on to detail how Malcolm's deafness had been brazenly disregarded from start to finish, resulting in an unjust arrest and a gross violation of his rights. Timmons, who had begun the day with such arrogant confidence, stood transfixed as the judge declared there was sufficient evidence not just to dismiss the charges against Malcolm entirely, deeming them baseless and motivated by discriminatory impulses, but also to recommend disciplinary action against Timmons for misconduct and abuse of authority. In fact, she indicated that she would be forwarding the case to Internal Affairs for further review, ensuring that Timmons's actions would not be swept under any institutional rug. The weight of that pronouncement settled in the officer's eyes, and for the first time, a flicker of panic replaced his sneer. Malcolm, on the other hand, felt a surge of gratitude and relief that, for all the obstacles he'd faced, truth had managed to shine through. The murmurs of approval that rippled through the crowd, particularly from Miss Grant and the other witnesses who had bravely come forward, reminded him of the reason he had stayed calm in the face of such blatant hatred. He believed that no matter how dark and oppressive an injustice might be, light still had the power to cut through it. But the judge's words didn't end with Timmons's disgrace. She turned her attention to Malcolm, articulating that people with disabilities must be treated with respect, that no officer is above the obligation to communicate effectively before resorting to force, and that an entire system must be scrutinized if it allows prejudice to run unchecked. Malcolm watched as Timmons grew rigid, his hands balling into fists at his sides, and in that moment it was clear to everyone in the room that the officer's career lay in tatters, that the very uniform he wore was now an uncomfortable reminder of how easily a person entrusted with authority can violate that trust. As for Malcolm, the charges against him were formally dropped, and with a tremor of emotion he tried to contain, he bowed his head in gratitude, silently thanking the judge, the interpreter, the teacher, the artist, and every other person who dared to bring the truth to light. The final blow came when Timmons's supervisor, who had been summoned to the proceedings, delivered the news that Timmons would be placed on immediate suspension pending further investigation, leaving little doubt, based on the evidence, that he would face termination before the month was out, effectively leaving him jobless. Shockwaves swept the gallery, but what resonated most powerfully were the resolute faces of those who had stood up for Malcolm, displaying a united front against the bigotry that had momentarily upended his life. As the session concluded, Timmons, in a last act of futile defiance, tried to defend himself with some sputtered claim of misunderstood intentions, but his words sounded hollow and were brushed aside as the bailiff escorted him out, that once mighty air of authority shattered beyond repair. Malcolm, surrounded by the warmth of grateful handshakes and relieved smiles, stepped into the hallway of the courthouse a free man, the trauma of the past day slowly beginning to loosen its grip on his heart. When he finally locked eyes with the senior partner from his firm, who had been discreetly waiting in the wings, Malcolm received a small nod that radiated pride and respect, a gesture that spoke volumes more than words ever could. He understood in that moment that although injustice had nearly robbed him of his freedom, it had also revealed his own inner steel and the depth of compassion from strangers who refused to let bigotry reign unchecked. Later, as he and Miss Grant emerged from the building into the fresh afternoon light, they paused on the courthouse steps. A soft breeze rustled the trees lining Greenville's wide avenues, as though nature itself welcomed Malcolm back to the world from which he had been so abruptly torn. Miss Grant gently reached for Malcolm's hand, signing a simple affirmation, "You are heard." Malcolm, his expression flooded with quiet determination, nodded, feeling the gravity of those words resonate through his entire being. He thought of the countless deaf individuals, the countless black men, the countless people of every background who had suffered under similar prejudice, but never received the vindication the court had provided him. In his chest there stirred a resolve to use this experience not as a source of bitterness, but as a testament to the power of truth, intelligence, and resilience, and perhaps to open doors for others who found themselves fighting against the same dark undercurrent of bias. As they parted ways, Malcolm cast one final glance back at the imposing stone structure of the courthouse, aware of how swiftly one's life could change within its walls, and how crucial it was to keep faith in the possibility of justice, even in a flawed world. In that fleeting moment, he felt neither triumphant nor vengeful, only a profound sense of relief and the lingering belief that, given time, even the harshest prejudice can be unmasked and dismantled by those brave enough to stand and speak. With that thought firmly in mind, he headed home, free to return to the life he had worked so hard to build, profoundly changed by this experience, yet more determined than ever to ensure no one else would have to endure such injustice without a fighting chance to be heard.